Very good afternoon and welcome back to the BBC's Election Centre. There is just one seat yet to declare in this general election of 2015. We have 649 declared, and we know now that David Cameron and the Conservatives have won a majority, something that no one had expected or predicted before last night. But this is where we stand. These are the seats that have actually been declared, with one to go, and that one, by the way, is in St Ives. And at this stage, the Conservatives are on 330 and Labour are on 232. We're projecting a majority of 12, we think, for the Conservatives. A 12 majority for the Conservatives, which isn't a very big majority, but let's face it, given the fact that no one had predicted this position, no one had predicted the Conservatives would do so well. It is a remarkable outcome after this election campaign. So, St Ives will be coming, I think, within an hour and a half. It's a long count, bringing in the boxes from the Isles of Scilly, and it's logistically a challenge. So, the St Ives result will be with us by around 3:30. Let me look at the overall seat count for you. Let's have a look at that so that if you're just joining us, I can bring you right up to date on that. 330 and 232, we've seen those on the Palace of Westminster already. Look at the SNP count. 56 seats out of 59 in Scotland. It's a rampaging performance by the Scottish National Party under Nicola Sturgeon. And one of those MPs is the former First Minister, Alex Salmond, who's been returned for the seat of Gordon. The Democratic Unionists on 8, that's no change. And then look at the Lib Dems, because in Nick Clegg's own words, they've suffered a punishing and cruel night. They're on 8 seats. They've lost 48 seats. And the result of that is that Mr Clegg has resigned today as party leader. Ed Miliband, the Labour leader, has also resigned today. Nigel Farage, the UKIP leader, has also resigned today. They've been pegged to one seat, just one seat, despite the hopes that they had. So that's where we stand right now. And as I say, we've got one seat to go. I've got Andrew Marr with me in the studio with plenty to talk about. And we've got Joe Coburn too. And we've got Jackie Smith, I'm pleased to say, Labour's former Home Secretary. Good to have you with us, Jackie. And Norman Smith is in Downing Street, our assistant political editor. Let's have a word with you first, Norman, on what we can expect this afternoon, because already there's a lot of speculation about the shape of this government and who will be in certain posts by the end of today, possibly.
I think that's quite possible. I think what you'll see is a determined attempt at continuity and normality and business as usual. So I'm sure they will seek to have the key people in place as soon as possible. But the thing that strikes me most is just looking at the numbers, Hugh. A majority of 12, yes, is a surprise and is a stunning result for Mr Cameron. But I was just looking back at what John Major enjoyed. He had a majority of 21. Now, that was whittled away by by-elections, but we know the grief, the pain, the angst, the horror he went through as he was pretty much at the beck of call of his backbenchers over Europe. And the difficulty for Mr Cameron is, despite his success last night, he is vulnerable now to his backbenchers, and much will depend on how Labour choose to play this, because under John Major, Labour basically were in cahoots with the Eurosceptics, and it caused Mr Major all sorts of grief. The real unknown is whether Labour will seek to play the same game again, in which case Mr Cameron could be facing an extraordinarily difficult time in the Commons.
Any thoughts, Norman, at this stage on the kinds of jobs that may be filled today, or are we being slightly too ambitious?
We've not had any details or any indication so far of who might get what. I suppose the one post which we're going to look at with most interest is who is Foreign Secretary. I say that because we know now that there is going to be an EU referendum. Absolutely integral to that will be the negotiations. And there was some speculation before the election as to whether Mr Cameron would want the Chancellor, George Osborne, to take up that position as his most trusted lieutenant to actually do the nitty-gritty hard work of renegotiation. But then that to some extent removes him from the main frame of British politics and also from the critical question of getting the deficit paid off. So my gut instinct would be that he would want to keep George Osborne where he is because the economy is absolutely so central to British politics.
Norman, we'll talk to you again later on in Downing Street. Thanks very much, Norman Smith. Joe, some thoughts then on what we're expecting and indeed some of the contributions we've had on social media as well about this.
Yes, well, things are now actually starting to come in. As you say, this was not the story we expected to be talking about at this particular time, and I think it has taken quite a few Tories by surprise themselves. Everybody, we were all discussing the idea of deals, of legitimacy, of red lines, and here we are. David Cameron has a majority. We've just seen him at the lectern. In terms of looking ahead to jobs, as you mentioned, let's take this tweet from Ian Dale, Tory commentator on LBC Radio. He is saying straw in the wind. Graham Brady, he being the head of the 1922 Backbench Committee of Tory MPs, striding down Whitehall into Downing Street. He says, new chief whip. He looked horrified to see me. I'm sure he did. Two things to say about that. Graham Brady is the sort of conduit, if you like, from the leadership to the backbenchers, and that relationship was quite fractious for a lot of the time over the last 5 years. David Cameron was criticised for not having enough contact with his own backbenchers because he had to satisfy the Liberal Democrats, is what Number 10 used to say. Now, is this about building bridges? Is this about mending fences? Is this part of the reaching out strategy that we heard from David Cameron as he stood outside the steps of Number 10? Graham Brady would be the person to talk to.
Jackie, welcome. I'm just wondering at this point, given that Ed Miliband wanted to be in the position today where he was sorting out cabinet jobs, and sadly for him he's not, and indeed he's announced his resignation, do you think he was right to announce it as quickly as he did?
I think he probably was, given the scale of the disappointment that lots of people felt about the result. I mean, I have to say, I think that in the last 6 weeks, he's actually run and led Labour activists in a very good campaign. I mean, not good in that it didn't end up where we wanted it to end up, but, you know, let's not forget there were thousands of people knocking on doors, delivering the request for 4 million conversations that he made, which, frankly, when he made it, I thought people were never going to manage. He kept the party focused on what it needed to do. So I think that was a good campaign, but we're not where we wanted to be, and I think, therefore, it was right for him to say, I'm moving ahead, so that actually in the party we can have that debate about what we need to do to get back as quickly as possible. And I also thought he was right to say, we will be back. Look, you know, I joined the Labour Party in 1979. I had to wait 18 years before we had the Labour government. I don't want to wait 18 years before we have another one. And I don't think I'm going to have to, incidentally.
Jim Murphy went into much more detail about, you know, the causes, as he saw them, of Labour's meltdown in Scotland, some of which obviously were common causes with the rest of the UK. Ed Miliband didn't do that in his speech. Did you agree with Jim Murphy's prescription, which is the party basically lost touch?
I do agree with that, actually. And whilst I'm not an expert on Scotland, I think in places like my former constituency in Redditch, those seats in the sort of middle of England that in 1997, for example, we were winning easily. This time we needed to win to form a government and we didn't. I think we need to focus a bit on those. We were quite successful in quite a few seats in London, but there's something different going on there. And I think it's people need to feel that you understand their hopes and their fears. And frankly, if they don't think that, others will be able to exploit their fears. And that's what I think, for example, happened with some of the votes that went from Labour to UKIP, or never came back to Labour and went to UKIP when we needed them to in order to form a government.
Just a quick thought. We'll pause in a second because we'll have more viewers joining us, but just a quick thought on what kind of candidates you'd like to see in the race for the Labour leadership. What kind of spectrum of candidates would you like to see?
Well, I think there are a lot of potentially good people. I think perhaps it may be time for us to look perhaps to the next generation, because I think we're going to have quite an in-depth discussion about the way in which the party goes forward.
Jackie, just pause for a second because coverage continues here on BBC One. And welcome to everyone just joining us. You're very welcome to join this election coverage today. We've lots to talk about this afternoon because although we now know the result, which is a good place to be, I mean, barring one seat, that is, in St Ives, which is yet to come, There's lots to talk about in terms of what this new government could mean under David Cameron, and, of course, what is the future for Labour, given the experiences that it's had. And I'll ask Andy Marr about the Scottish context in a second. Just to finish on that thought that you were developing earlier, Jackie, about this Labour leadership contest, the kinds of people that you think should be involved, and actually the kind of leader that you think can do for Labour what it needs, which is to rethink, to revisit some values maybe, and to regroup.
There's a real challenge here, though, because one of the problems in 2010 was that we had quite a lengthy leadership contest, and whilst we were having it, frankly, the agenda was being set by the Tories. So the challenge here is that we do need to find a leader who can, yes, develop the policies, but actually who can connect with people, who people in my former constituency think, yeah, they get me. They, you know, they are going to make my life better in the future than it has been. But at the same time, I think as a party, we mustn't let the government off the hook. Yes, they've won the right to govern, but frankly, you know, I'm quite keen to make sure that they are delivering economic prosperity for everybody, not just a few. I chair a big teaching hospital. I want to see if they are actually going to come up with the goods in terms of the NHS. And we mustn't let... We've got to oppose whilst we're also trying to find the route to our future and actually to win our way back to government.
A quick thought, if I may. Sorry, Joe, to Jackie, but, I mean, personal cost. We have lots of people who have lost their seats overnight. Just look at these images here. We're going to see Tessa Munt here, I think. There we are. So, one of many losses last night, and I suppose for lots of people watching and just voting yesterday, you know, you vote, you think about the cause, and actually there is a human impact, isn't there, on lots of people who have not just been representing constituencies, some of them for many years. You think of Simon Hughes since the early 80s, for example. Yeah. Some of them for shorter periods. But just tell us a little bit from your experience, Jackie, what that is, what you go through when that happens.
Yeah. It's tough, and, you know, frankly, I've had quite a long night and it hasn't been great, but it wasn't as bad as 5 years ago when I was standing on a stage and losing my seat. And I think, actually, whatever party they're from, people who are willing to put themselves forward for election, and I said 5 years ago, you know, it's important that people stand when they fear they're going to lose as well as when they hope they're going to win. And if people aren't willing to do that, we won't have a democracy. Yeah. So, you know, my heart, I don't expect all the public to be thinking, oh, how hard done by they are for losing their jobs. I understand a bit of what that's like. What I can say to them is, look, there's life after Parliament.
Yeah. It's not a bad message to give, is it? Yeah.
You've absolutely survived. Do you think, though, there will be questions about, was it because the Labour Party wasn't left-wing enough, looking at the MPs that are now left in the parliamentary party? Look,
there may well be those questions, but to that I would say, well, just a minute. Actually, we did quite well in London, which you might think would respond to a more left-wing, whatever that means, agenda, whereas actually in those Middle England constituencies that we needed to win, we didn't do so well. So actually it's not as straightforward as we needed to be more left-wing or even more right-wing. I mean, I do think that what experience shows is that you win government from the centre of the political spectrum, and I think that's where we need to be.
Andy, I mentioned Jim Murphy. Just,
yes.
You know, you had lots of interesting things to say about this earlier. The task for Labour in Scotland can be summed up how?
It may be an impossible task, is the first thing. I mean, the SNP have done so well that rebuilding from the ashes is a very, very long process for Labour. Who knows? I mean, the SNP are now in the position, somebody's just said on Twitter quite rightly, winning landslides isn't always a good thing because you have huge expectations, you have huge numbers of troops you have to control and discipline, and if the SNP have done so well in this election and yet have to confront David Cameron's Conservatives, no kind of obvious deals with them of any kind at all, and then in Scotland, are dominating Scotland, there is nowhere for them to look for excuses. They have got to deliver some really serious increases and improvements in people's lives in Scotland. So it might be quite difficult for them. So the Labour Party will be looking ahead, frankly, hoping the SNP fail in some of these high hopes that they've raised. It should be said, the SNP are not like the wolves coming down from the fold. This is a story that goes back to the 1920s. It's they've been very deeply rooted in Scottish public life for a very, very long time. They don't come from nowhere.
No.
We've got a big victory celebration, V-Day moment coming up. It was the Second World War that really formed the Unionist parties deeply into the Scottish psyche. We had the Tory years and the Labour years in the 1950s and 60s. And then what happens is deindustrialisation, the discovery of oil, changed Scotland entirely. The SNP came onto the agenda. They brought down, of course, Jim Callaghan's Labour government in 1979. Margaret Thatcher came in. The Scots didn't like Margaret Thatcher very much. The Tories started to fall back very radically. Tony Blair arrives. The Scots did not like Tony Blair very much either. Labour start to fall back radically. They get the Parliament, and that doesn't help the Unionist parties at all. But this is a long and complicated story. Very, very interesting one, in my view.
It certainly is. Andy, thank you very much. Can we pause a second? Because I think my colleague, BBC's Patrick Burns, is joining us from Warwick, and clearly this is a very, very interesting area for us overnight, Patrick. So why don't you just recap a little and tell us what stood out for you? What was of interest to you there?
Well, what we've just had here, Hugh, is one of those, what we thought were marginal Conservative seats where they were defending a 3,500 majority in Warwick and Leamington, and that has near doubled, in fact, to around 6,000. In the other seat here, Jeremy Wright, the Attorney General, has retained his Kenilworth and Southam seat with a thumping 20,000 majority. And that has been the story, as you say, of Conservative, apparently marginal seats in this region, which has had a habit of flip-flopping between Labour and the Conservatives. And we saw the succession of them, beginning with Nuneaton, which was described by Emily earlier on as the sort of Basildon moment of 2015. Doubling of the Conservative majority there, where Labour had been expected to mount a very serious challenge if they were to be on course for being the largest single party. And in fact, talking to Conservative activists in their team there in Nuneaton, I wondered what exactly had been the story that had actually at the last minute turned these constituencies so decisively their way. And maybe the answer, you know, is that it really is the economy stupid, because what they said to me is that in these areas where unemployment has been falling very fast generally, and these young, hard-working families we keep hearing about, we were told were sort of benefiting and indeed reflecting in their voting preferences that extra help with the costs of childcare, help for first-time home buyers. And that seems to be the story that has held sway in other places too. North Warwickshire, spectacularly, the Conservatives defending a majority of just 54, and absolutely enormous explosion of Conservative support there compared with their original standing from 5 years ago. And similarly in Worcester, a remarkable distinction there actually, where they've strengthened their position again, another Labour Party target. And Robin Walker, son of the late Lord Peter Walker, can celebrate the fact that the faithful Cathedral City, as it's called, has actually elected a Member of Parliament from the winning party in every general election since 1974, which is quite a distinction, I think you'll agree.
Patrick, it certainly is something to hang on to. Thank you very much for sharing that with us. Patrick Burns there, who was our colleague there, our political editor in the Midlands. Now, Joe, you were mentioning that there was a very interesting contribution from the man the American, who'd been paid to advise the Labour campaign. Is that right?
Absolutely. He was the senior aide, David Axelrod, to President Obama. He helped run the campaign here for Ed Miliband. Of course, there was a lot of conversation about how much it would cost to have him come over here. But let's have a look at what he's actually said following the result and following that resignation speech from Ed Miliband. Disappointed by Thursday's result. Always be proud of Ed Miliband, his heartfelt battle to make Britain work for all her people. But Jackie Smith, the sort of implication there, and again, when you look back and reflect on Labour's campaign, was did they focus far too much on their core vote?
Well, I mean, clearly we didn't attract enough people, otherwise it would be a very different situation today. Although what I think is interesting is, you know, I really think we need to get into the details of what has happened in different parts of the country, because clearly there are important issues in Scotland. In London, we were taking seats from Tories and from Lib Dems, whereas in other parts of England that we needed to win, we weren't. So I think a bit of a reflection and detailed look at how that happened. In other words, you know, David Axelrod, to a certain extent, didn't succeed in creating a campaign that got to everybody across the country. And that's what you're going to need to do if you're going to get back into government again.
OK, Jackie, and Joe, thanks very much. And we're back in a moment because it's nearly 2:30. It's a very important day today because it's the 70th anniversary of the commemoration of Victory in Europe Day. And for that reason, there is a very formal service and ceremony happening in the Cenotaph in Whitehall. And that is, of course, not just an event in central London. It's an event that's taking place throughout the United Kingdom. There are other events in Wales and Scotland too. But, of course, crucially for us, because we're looking at the election today, without wishing to detract in any way from what's going on in Whitehall, we're interested in the party leaders and the other important dignitaries will be there to mark this historic occasion and to pay tribute to all those who fought for freedom in the Second World War. So, we're giving way for about an hour here on BBC One, and that will have coverage of the VE Day commemoration in Whitehall. And you can watch the whole ceremony there uninterrupted. We'll continue in just a moment on BBC Two and on the BBC News channel for those who want to stay with this political story today. So, bye for now.